This is the story of how the hip thrust came to be. So picture this. The year is 2006, the date is October 12th, just over 10 years ago as of last week. And I'm sitting in my house in Scottsdale at the time, and I'm watching a UFC fight. I'm watching Ken Shamrock fight Tito Ortiz, and I don't care who wins, I just want it to be a good fight. But quickly, Tito Ortiz full mounts Ken Shamrock, and he's, raining down punches, and I want Ken Shamrock to escape. I want him to buck his hips so he can escape out of there and the fight lasts longer, but he's not even trying. And I'm like, he must not be strong for that position because he's not even trying to escape. And I know from experience, because not only did I fight my twin brother every day of my life up until we were like 16, I also did jiu-jitsu, and while it is a lot harder to escape full mount with like really good fighters, if you do have freakishly powerful hips, it helps a lot. So as a certified strength and conditioning specialist, I started thinking there needs to be an exercise that improves, that can help improve that skill. Because it's not like you can be like, hey bro, sit on my hips and straddle me and I'm gonna pump out 30 reps. So I needed a way to have resistance. And then I thought, it's just a little short range of motion. If we could sink way down, you could triple the range of motion if you had two different, surfaces where you could sink your hips down in the middle. And so right then, I thought of an idea. And so I go out to my garage, and my girlfriend at the time, Jeannie, was with me. I'm like, Jeannie, come outside and help me. And so she comes out in the garage, and I'm like, we need to move this glute ham developer next to this reverse hyper. And so I've had this is the exact same piece of equipment from 10 years ago. I've had these for like 12 or 14 years. But this is an Elite FTS GHD, and this is a West Side reverse hyper. So she's like, why can't this wait till tomorrow? And I'm like, fine, you know what, just go inside, I'll do it myself. And so I moved this about, like 3-4 feet away from the reverse hyper. And I didn't think of using a barbell at that time. I thought of using a dip belt with weight suspended underneath me. And so here's what it looked like. The picture, at that time I used 4 45-pound plates, not just one. So it was way harder to get into position. But just for the sake of illustrating this to you, I will show you what it looked like. So here's what it looked like. And so, at around the 12th rep, my left glute felt like it was going to cramp. And I was like, oh my God. I had been doing squats and deadlifts and lunges, but I had never felt that cramping sensation. And so I thought, you know what? I need to popularize this exercise. And it sounds kind of lame, but I went outside and I looked up into the sky and I went, my life is going to completely change from this point forward. Because I knew I was going to try and learn as much as possible about this movement and try to popularize it as much as possible. And that's been the case over the past 10 years. So at that point I said, I got to teach people this. I need to write an article. I'll write an article for Testosterone Nation, for T-Nation, and I'll teach them how to do this. And I'm like, oh, that's not a good idea because, first of all, how many people have a glute ham developer and a reverse hyper or something like this? And the setup is cumbersome. People are going to like to, it's really hard when you're using heavy weight. And also it can be dangerous because let's say you didn't have rubber surfaces, or let's say the person pushed too hard this way, these can slide apart. And you could theoretically come crashing down and hit your tailbone on this or something and do some damage. So I quickly realized this is not a good idea. There needs to be another way. There needs to be a prototype. I need to make a prototype. I need to make an apparatus to allow people to perform this exercise. And so I'll show you the progression of apparatuses that over the years that allow you to perform the hip thrust. So here's the first prototype, and I called this the Skorcher. And it's actually a terrible design, but at the time it's the best I could do. And what I wanted to do was mimic this setup right here. But I got a lot of things wrong. So first of all, I realized how hard it is to get the upholstery right, because this is really dense. It's not thick enough. You can almost see the ridges in here. Second of all, at the time I wanted these to serve as band pegs, but also the pegs you use to adjust the unit. And what I had to do, if you wanted to adjust the length of the unit, I had to go like this. And to get in here, pull both of these out at the same time, and then push back and do like a kickback to get this back. It was like nearly impossible. And then finally, this here had pins that went through, but this doesn't glide. See how I wanted to glide? You have to like shimmy it into position. But it was a good starting point. And again, I had not thought of using a barbell. It was just band resistance that you could connect to here and then single leg off of here. We also like to use this guy to do Bulgarian split squats at the time. So I quickly realized this was not an ideal invention, so I moved on to the next version of the Skorcher. So here's the next Skorcher model, and this was the next progression, and I really liked it. I still love it to this day, but it does have some issues. But this was the model that I used at my training facility at the time. I had a personal training studio called Lifts. It was in a nice part of Scottsdale, Gainey Ranch, and I had my studio for 2 years, and this is how everybody hip thrusted. So every client I ever had did hip thrusts off of here. They started out with body weight. Once they could do 3 sets of 20, we'd move them to bands and barbell, and we also did single leg off of here. And so here's how it worked. And for the barbell, it was kind of, if you didn't have spotters, so at lifts, we would have 2 of the trainers stand on each side. They would pick the barbell up, and the person would slide under, and we'd set it in their lap. So that worked great, but how many people have 2 spotters following around throughout life? But anyway, for bands it was easy. For barbell, if you didn't have a spotter, you had to, the barbell fit in this design. I wanted, you could see how a barbell like with plates could fit right in here. So that was the idea, that plates could fit in here nice. So what you'd have to do is deadlift the barbell, sit here, and then scoot down, do the set, and then you'd finish, you'd scoot up, and then you'd put the bar back down. Now, that's great when you're using 135 and 225, but we got up to 405 back then. This is harder than when using just a standard bench. So that was all we did back in the day, was 405 for like 5 reps. Me and my trainers could do that. It was a pain in the butt. You would be exhausted just getting the bar into place and then putting it back down. But here's how it looks with bands. So we would just pick one of these guys up and you slide under like this. What was nice is there's tension on my hips right now. And then from here, come up. So there's tension throughout the entire range of motion. Tension when you're at the bottom, tension at the top. You have this huge giant foot plate. So I can go low, I can go high, I can go wide, sumo. So this was great, but it did have some issues. This was gonna cost a fortune. And so at this point in time, I tried to start thinking of how I could teach people how to do the hip thrust without any special equipment. So this might sound silly to you, but even 2 years after I had thought of the hip thrust, I had never thought of using a standard bench. It never even occurred to me. We always used the Skorcher. And so at this point in time, I realized I wanted to, all my clients at the time were telling me, Bret, you need to popularize your methods. The world needs to be doing this stuff. And I was too tired, I was too drained. I'd train people all day long, then I'd work out, and then I'd want to go home and veg out and watch TV because I was so drained. But I decided to close up my studio and focus on expanding my reach. So I started up a blog, I started social media, and I knew that I couldn't popularize the hip thrust if you had to buy an expensive giant scorcher in order to perform it. So I started thinking, how could I do this without any specialized equipment? And then one day I'm like, wait, I guess you could use a random bench. Now it's nice to have both the hips and the feet elevated, because then you can sink your hips way down and get even more stretch on the hamstrings. But it's still a great exercise just using a standard bench. And so this was the next logical progression in the, well, this would probably be the first logical progression in the hip thrust evolution, but it took me a couple years to stumble upon this. And so one of the problems with just using a bench, there are a couple of problems. Number one, if you have giant legs, if you're a big guy, you got to roll the barbell over. If you're using padding, well, one of the problems is if you're just using the barbell, it hurts your hips. You need padding. And so the best thing I've found so far is the squat sponge. I love it. So we use a squat sponge, but if you use the squat sponge and you just use a standard bar, you got to roll it over your legs and it gets stuck. So it's annoying. Well, right now I'm using the buffalo bar. So you see this is curved, so it just rolls right over. Goes right over the hips. So it's really nice. But one of the other problems is some of the benches are really tall. If I hip thrust from right here, I need my back lower. So what I will need to do, as soon as I start to perform the hip thrust, is I will need to come up and walk myself up to about right here. Come down, come up. So that's currently how I recommend most people perform the hip thrust from gyms, is get into place, come up. See how I elevated myself? You don't need to touch the ground because you might lose that position. So just come about right here, come up. Now, I don't like having to move stuff around. So we had been performing the hip thrust off of a standard bench. Even though I still have my scorchers, I wanted to do it off the bench just like everyone else was doing so I could learn more and better teach people. But eventually I realized I like having a standalone unit. I don't like moving my benches around. This needs to be secured against something or it can move backwards. I don't want to hip thrust out of the power rack. I want to use my benches for benching. So I wanted to make a unit that people could buy, but I didn't want it to cost, $2,000 because most people can't afford that. I wanted to make a unit that people could use from their homes, and so I came up with the hip thruster. So this is the hip thruster, and I have two models. This is hip thruster 1.0 and hip thruster 2.0. And hip thruster 1.0 was nice. I still have one, I still use it, but two issues with this one, and it's really not that big of a deal, but see these band pegs, they're not optimal, and I'll show you why when I show you. This is kind of like how the bands were with the Skorcher. They ruin your bands over time because of the way they have to be put in here. And then the second issue is I had this at I originally wanted it to be 16 inches in height, that's about the ideal height, but this padding was so thick that we ended up, it ended up being closer to 17 inches. And so I feel like it's a little tall. It's okay for me, but for a lot of the women it was too high. And so the next model was the hip thruster 2.0. And this model is nice because it's an inch lower. Let me tell you a funny story. I got this model right as I was finishing my PhD. And the night that I submitted my PhD thesis, it was I think it was the end of July of 2015. So it was like July 31st or whatever. Let's see, June, February, March, April, May, June, July. Yeah, 31 days in July. So it was July 31st. I submit my thesis. I had to submit it before midnight. And I didn't even care that it was midnight. I just wanted to celebrate. I wanted to work out. I go out into my garage and I'm feeling on top of the world, and I hip thrusted. At that time, my best hip thrust was 700, well, I hit a 725 pound hip thrust, which at that time was my best. Now I've got 800 pounds. But I hit a 725 pound hip thrust, which was the most I'd ever done before that was 675. And I was feeling so good, I got stronger, I'm done with my thesis. And then that whole next week, we started using this model, and all of my female clients that week set PRs. And I realized it's not that I got stronger. When you lower the height of the pad, even just an inch, it makes a difference. You're stronger with the pad lowered a little bit. And I actually understand it now from a physics standpoint after working with these complicated equations with a mechanical engineer. But yes, you're a little bit stronger with a lowered height. But this works for most people. If we have like 5 foot tall women or probably with 4'11" to 5'2", or women that are even taller but have freakishly long legs and short torsos, we use this guy. And you can buy an Eric's balance pad or a knockoff, yes for all. And you sit your butt there, and effectively it's like you're lowering the bench height because you're sitting your butt there. But what's really nice about this model is the band pegs. So this is so nice because if I want to do band hip thrusts, all I do is just wrap this over and then get it right into place like that. So it's just such an ideal setup. Now, I'm not going to show you barbell again, because I've showed you that. What I do want to show you is we've also been using a hip circle. So here's what I call double band hip thrust. And I will get this in. I'll put this right above my knees. Now I'm doubling up the rolls of the glutes. So now I've got to use my glutes to keep the knees out, to create hip abduction and external rotation, while I thrust the hips up and down, moving the hips from flexion into extension and back down. So here's what this looks like. Okay, get into place. And if you do 3 sets of 20 with this, you will have a glute burn like you've never felt before. So this is the evolution of the hip thrust. Here's where we stand now. There's currently hundreds of variations. You can use all sorts of equipment. You can do feet elevated. You can do them off the ground. You can do shoulders elevated. You can elevate both the shoulders and the feet. You can do them with barbell. You can do them with bands. You can do them with combinations of loading. You can do single leg. You can do double leg. You can vary your stance with. You can vary the height of elevation. There's so many different ways to do it. Most people can find several different bridging and thrusting variations that make them feel their glutes really well. But I'm very proud of this 10-year progression, and I'm committed to future research and learning even more as time goes on. I'm currently involved with a really cool study that's about to take place. It'll take a couple years, but once that's done, we will know so much more about the hip thrust and how it compares to squats and deadlifts for all types of functional transfer and also activation and hypertrophic adaptation. So I want to thank everyone for watching this, and thank all the people who have supported me over the years and who believed in me and trusted me and didn't say, man, this guy, who's this crazy guy thrusting all this weight around? You believed in me enough to give it a try. So thank you very much.